Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It is the intellectual creme de la creme that sticks it out until this session on a Sunday at Clifton. But what a panel and what a topic we have to engage you, possibly enrage you, but certainly, I hope, involve you. So we'll be having our debate for the next 3/4 of an hour or so, and then we very much like your questions, your challenges, and where you think everyone except the chair left something to be desired. I'm Anne McElvoy. I'm executive editor of Politico and a broadcaster and columnist, but my job here today is really to keep my four stimulating and talented panelists honest, on track and on time as we discuss a subject that I think has hung in the air a lot throughout the weekend. I'm very pleased we have here the format to discuss it. And that really is the transatlantic relationship, not so much in the occasionally rather worthy way that we read about that in terms of political interdependency, defence and security, and all the things that we know matter a lot. But what underpins it? And the title of our debate is rather challenging on that score. Atlantic Dominion, how American culture has distorted Britain's view of itself. So someone, I think clearly the title of this debate may have been written by someone who's in search of a Daily Mail column. But it does put its finger on something that I think is very reactive. And it made me think when I was given this topic to lead the discussion. We are sitting here in Clifton, if you like, the epicenter of a transatlantic relationship. In many ways, down the years, its rich history, the glamour, the salons, the exchanges, the secrets, the diplomacy, the affairs. All of that speaks, I think, to the fact that Britain and America are intimately connected, in fact, frequently very intimately connected at Clifton. But that doesn't mean that this is a subject that doesn't, I think, have some edge to it. And when we look at culture wars, when you look at the import and the importance of American culture, and some, I think, including the person who came up with this topic for debate, thinks the overmight of American culture does give us some questions to explore. So let us do that, and I will introduce my panel in the order that they're going to answer the first question. And Tomiwa Owolade at the far end, for me, author and columnist. Latest book is This Is Not America, or Why Black Lives in Britain Matter. Quite a provocative title you took there.
Yeah, definitely.
So that didn't happen by accident, right?
I always think, what's the point of writing a non-fiction polemical book if you're not going to be provocative?
So you didn't call it Wither the Transatlantic Relationship. Munira Mirza, a graduate or perhaps a survivor of the Boris Johnson administration, who was a policy advisor to Boris Johnson over many years. She's now left the rough and tumble of politics behind and leads Civic Future, bringing more people into public life, but also, I think, crucially, Munira, from your point of view, looking to enhance the quality of public debate. And I'll be interested in how you think that relationship with the US plays into it. James Marriott is columnist for The Times on social and cultural matters, and a very sensible man. He also writes reviews of podcasts. And as a podcaster, James, I've always really admired you. You know, I just think you're so good at it. And so, oh God, was that too soon? And Emily Benn, the City of London councillor, possible Labour candidate at the next election if Keir Starmer has any sense. She has been a researcher at Harvard. She also has a really fascinating transatlantic background in view. And I think it would be fair to say, Emily, that you are here also going to focus a little bit on where the centre-left is going on this issue, and in the unlikely event of a Labour government, how that might... Well, I just wanted to wind you up, to be honest. In the possible event of a Labour government, which is quite interesting today, looking at whether polls are narrowing or not, what might we expect on that. But I thought I would just do a bit of a whisk round you all and ask what your favourite and least favourite American imports are. Tom, can I start with you?
I think my favourite American import is American culture. By culture, I mean American films, American novels, American TV shows, American music, American visual art. And my least favorite, you'd be very surprised to hear, is American racial politics.
Do you want to just one more sentence on that? Don't ask that to a man who's written a book about the subject. Why don't I? But just because, in a nutshell.
Because I think American racial politics is very particular to American history and doesn't translate to the histories and cultures of places around the rest of the world.
Right, so that's something we might dive into as a challenge in just a moment. Munira, what about you?
So my favourite import, I'll be slightly more precise than Tomiwa, which is the long-form television fiction series, which in the last 20 years, I think, has transformed television around the world. It's raised everyone's game. And it's American culture at its most sophisticated and insightful. And I think the quality of writing in America surpasses anything anywhere else. So it's the sort of high point of American culture. My least favourite is the way that Americans try and censor each other, both from the left and the right. And I think that's the other side of the coin. America has this incredible rich sense of itself and insight into itself, but then it also is just incredibly bad at handling disagreement.
James, a bouquet and a brickbat from you.
So I'm going to say that my favourite import is the poet T.S. Eliot. The fact that he edited his life basically sounding more English than any English person and dressed, in kind of three-piece suits and sitting in London clubs maybe is a sign of my ambivalence towards American imports. And my least favourite is definitely Twitter, where I think if T.S. Eliot's produced some of the if T.S. Eliot's produced some of the best writing of the best in human history, Twitter's probably produced some of the worst. And I always think if Twitter had been British, it would probably been more polite, wouldn't it? I don't know. Maybe that's over optimistic.
Or would it have just been hedging around things all the time? Well, I don't
Very
really
passive
know.
aggressive.
What do you think? Not sure.
The best one I would say, well, I was going to say Frasier.
Good call.
But then I thought maybe that being disloyal to my grandmother, who was American, who moved to Britain, so maybe she was actually my favourite American import. And the worst, I hate Halloween. I hate what that's done. I also hate the phrase running for office when people talk about British politics. In that way, I blame my upbringing, but you don't run for office in the UK, you stand. So forgive me, the pedantic person on the panel here. Major important issue there, but it does annoy me.
It's a major policy issue of the era there. But I do get that, and also the impact. I get that. When did I start to say that? The way that Americanisms have probably infused all of our language. And if you find me saying circling back, reaching out, or to your point, just say, get rid of me now. So let's go back to that idea, if we could, Tomiwa, that it has been not helpful, another terrible, kind of doesn't say what it really means, not good, to bring in ideas about kind of how we look at race, how we look at identity, and impose them, as I think you suggested, on the British debate. If I put the question the other way around, well, if these things are pretty universal and lots of people feel that they have similar experiences, are we missing out on something?
Yeah, you could say, and I could have also mentioned, to be slightly contrarian, I could have also mentioned American racial politics as my favourite import, because for many black people in the UK, they would argue, understandably, that the very fact that race is something which is spoken about in America, and America is the most powerful country in the world, means that they themselves, as black people in the UK, feel more confident about talking about their own particular racial experiences. But as to how useful the American framework is, I would say in response to that, that if we genuinely care about the inequalities in British society, the only effective way of addressing those inequalities is by being more specific in our focus. To give a concrete example, rather than making generalizations about the black community and assuming that it's a homogeneous term, we should be more mindful of the fact that there are multiple cultures, ethnicities, nationalities that are encompassed by that term. And black British people do not share a universal experience. So, for instance, in school, Black Caribbean pupils are more than twice as likely to be excluded from secondary schools as Black African pupils. Black African pupils also have a higher GCSE and A-level attainment rate. And I would argue, if we are genuinely invested in addressing those inequalities, viewing Black people through this abstract universalist lens is completely counterproductive.
Do you approve of capping up Black, which I think is one of those kind of subtle distinction, but it causes, as you will know, and I think you've also reflected on some of your writing, it's exactly the kind of issue, I was going to say micro issue, but for some people it is, it's bigger than that divides people. Where do you stand on it?
I don't agree with it. I can understand why it's done in an American context, because Black Americans, many of them would consider themselves an ethnicity rather than a particular racial group. And they would say, well, Irish American is capitalized, Jewish American is capitalized, Italian American is capitalized. Why can't we be capitalized as well? So I can understand it from an American perspective, but from a more global perspective, I just find it completely confusing and perplexing.
Emily, you've watched this close up and taken part in very lively debates in the last couple of years in the Labour Party. Do you think that the left, which obviously is a very broad term as is use of the word the right, but there is a sense perhaps between the centre-left and the left, and even within those camps in Labour, that there are a number of different views about this? I think, shall we put it this way, that the party leadership would rather were not on the front pages associated with them. What do you think the healthy way is for the opposition to have a position on this without tangling itself in identity politics that a lot of voters are not going to be very interested in or indeed reject?
Well, when you have to be brave about how you talk about some of these issues, and it can be far too easy to sort of run away from them. The thing I think about, Britain, which is, my mother is originally from India, my father is American English, is that, we have this amazing history of and the fastest growing ethnic group in Britain is mixed race Britons that we don't really talk about, and how that has, done so many brilliant things for British society, and there are so many things we could talk about that, and, the sort of confidence and intellectual confidence sort of to talk about how Britain is very different to America. But if I may say, you talk about the left, the one thing I really would like to say first about how sometimes the left sort of talk about America. It's got a very complicated history with it. It loves it and it hates it. It wants to blame it for things and yet at the same time needs its help. It's so easy to sort of say, well, at least we're not America, as a sort of get out of jail free card when you're talking about issues. So, centre-left, Labour Party, what is our national religion? It's the National Health Service. Now, there are so many things about that are so challenging, particularly now. You look at the demographic change, you look at how difficult some of the aspects of reform of the National Health Service need to be. But so often I'm in meetings, in centre-left meetings and Labour Party meetings, and someone will inevitably just say, oh, well, at least we're not America, and, we're not going to be like America, and blah, blah, blah. It belies the sort of domestic challenges that we have in Britain, and it sort of gets us away from some of the harder things about the reality of what we're like, because we're sort of playing it off against America, and that's been a tradition of many things of British left I find deeply annoying and misguided, and a wasted opportunity about what you can genuinely learn from what America is brilliant at. You miss all of that if you have that sort of instinctive approach, which is sort of prevalent in so many issues.
And it also makes it much more difficult to do any sort of melding of public and private, doesn't it, around the health service? The health service needs elements of private sector in the background increasingly as it goes through into the... In fact, I think there's another big deal about to go through this week, which will cause great screaming. But it is, I also, people say, well, is it going to be sold off? You think, yeah, do you think like they're absolutely dying to have it?
Well, it's not a serious response to ways sort of tackle genuine long-term challenges. And I was listening to Rishi Sunak earlier. I know the phrase is now long-term decisions for the future. It's just not a sensible approach to have, and it's one that is far too prevalent.
Yes, long-term there did turn out to mean 2035 instead of 2030 on net zero. But that was a short-term, long-term. Munira, what do you make of this? You indicated in your opening remarks that you thought this was actually doing harm rather than just being distracting or irrelevant or a bit silly to bring in too much from the American debate. What are you thinking of specifically?
First of all, I want to just urge everyone to buy Tomiwa's book, because I think it's a brilliant very fact-based description of life as a black Briton and the history of black Britain. And
I've not paid Munira to say that.
and brings a lot of clarity and much needed sort of honesty about the debate, because I was in number 10 when the George Floyd murder happened and when the protests started around the UK. And obviously those protests reflect a lot of upset and emotion from people about racial disparities, continued racial disparities in Britain. But I remember, and I could see it out of my office actually, looking down on the street on Whitehall, the kinds of placards and signs that people were holding, and the way people in the media were talking. They were being interviewed on the street, the protesters, and they were saying, it feels just like the experience here in Britain, and the police are just as brutal here, and there's violence here. And I thought, I've been involved in discussions about race politics for a very long time. And it struck me as bizarre that people assumed that what was happening in America was the same as what was happening here. And we do have some problems, definitely, with policing. We certainly have inequality in Britain. We certainly have racism. But it felt like people were somewhat ignorant, actually, about the black British community. So the largest black ethnic community in Britain is now no longer black Caribbean, it's black African. And the outcomes are quite different, as Tomiwa suggested. The largest ethnic group is actually Indian and Pakistani. And as Emily says, the largest, fastest growing group is mixed race, as is also the case in America. And all of that is sort of obscured by the way in which Americans and way in which we increasingly talk about race politics is sort of good versus evil, black versus white, all black people in kind of this sort of paradigm are seen as victims. All BAME, that's the kind of categorization that policymakers like me talk about, are victims in some way of a system. And you just don't get any of the nuance. So lots of people won't see necessarily that actually British Indians do very well in terms of employment and educational outcomes. And British Chinese do as well. I must repeat, this is not to say that racism doesn't exist. There are inequalities, we must tackle them. But I find that the way in which Americans have started to conduct their race politics has become almost moralized to an extent where you have to choose a side, and you are demonized if you start to question some of the way in which it's talked about. I also think, by the way, Americans have a very distorted view of their own race politics and their own racial inequality. So having spoken to quite a few African Americans who are worried about the way in which black people are being portrayed as constant victims in their own society. And they think that will reinforce a sense of helplessness. So I don't think it's necessarily just the case that Americans are a different country. I think their own sort of craziness about how they argue, the polarization, the moral sanctimoniousness of both sides, the kind of religious quality in America. I mean, fundamentally, America is a very religious country. Even kind of left liberal atheists have a kind of religiosity in their kind of argument. Which,
puritanical.
Yeah, which, by the way, we exported to them in the 17th century, so we're to blame.
I think we maybe exported that the other way, but any Americans in the audience feel free to speak up when we felt that characterization was fair or otherwise. James, the question we were asked to address was about distortion and America culture allegedly distorting Britain's view of itself. But I mean, you write very broadly, very well on culture and on social issues. And I suppose if you look back, whether it is from the 1960s or even further back in time, American debates have always crossed the Atlantic. Sometimes it went the other way around, and Thomas Jefferson going off from France to America in the early years. But don't we think that this is inevitable, and that maybe this desire to put it in the prism of distortion is in itself a bit odd, because maybe it would be odd if it didn't cross the Atlantic?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the debate about the Americanization of British culture is more than 100 years old. In 1902, the Victorian campaigning newspaper editor W.T. Stead published a book called The Americanization of the World, which is, and if you go through the history of British journalism, there are columns complaining about the Americanization of, cinema, literature, TV, all the way up through the 20th century. This is happening. And, I guess, the job of being a newspaper columnist is to complain about all the same things that all newspaper columnists have been campaigning about for ages. I guess if we think the situation is different now, is perhaps that America, as an example to the world, was a happier place 60 years ago, 50 years ago. The America of the 60s was, it had its problems, but it was growing economically. It was nowhere near as politically divided as it is today. And I guess this huge, constant cultural influence on all of our lives that sits, that floods to us through the internet, through television, through the cinema, I think that influence is now a slightly more unhappy one, and the vibes coming to us from America are maybe not as good as they were. America, talking to some Americans here actually, is such an unhappy country politically, so divided, politics so broken, so at odds, culture wars and stuff. And I think an influence that was perhaps historically, in many ways, a happy and positive one, has become a slightly kind of toxic, dangerous thing to flood through into our culture.
You look like you wanted to comment on that.
It's you talk so eloquently about the sort of American culture influence in Britain. I think if I think about my time living, working, researching in America, the one thing that people knew about Britain was our culture. Our culture export was going the other way. I have a vested interest. I'm involved in the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and sort of two interesting things I think my experience there. First, it is like any higher education institution in Britain, grappling with sort of social progressive movements that permeate all of it. You cannot, it's no longer enough to be a brilliant educational institution doing music, drama and production arts. The students want to talk passionately and want to make change, but interestingly enough, a lot of their cultural references that they use when talking about oppression are American ones. Now, that is as I have conversations with the people, it's I'm not denying that the lived experience of people in America is X, but if you are trying to change things in Britain, having the right reference point in what you're trying to change is relatively important, because otherwise you are not tackling the problems here. Heaven knows there are enough problems in Britain that one should be focusing on. That's one, and the second one is, it is the students that go on from graduate to that from that conservatoire will be on American TV. They'll be singing on American radio. You talk about the American cultures in Britain, of America and Britain, but I don't think we should forget the other way. And when you spend time in America, it's easy to misunderstand. So it's always so easy to misunderstand what Britain's view, what people really think about Britain around the world. The one thing that they do really know and care, and the one thing where we're not good enough at using our own power and influence is understanding the importance of our culture and how that has permeated.
Munira?
Yeah,
speaks to some of your interests.
So I asked my 10-year-old son yesterday what 3 words he would use to describe America. And I thought it was fascinating. He's my son, so I'm very proud of him. He said the first word was patriotic, because he said, well, Americans seem to be very loyal to their country. Second was fat, which is slightly insulting, but probably statistically true. And the third was a word that he didn't want to say out loud to me, but he said it rhymes with messy. And I said, is it sexy? And he said, yes. And it was interesting that he thought of those 3 words, because actually that's the America I always thought of as a child. That it was a glamorous place, a bit gluttonous and greedy, but it was a kind of confident, vibrant, very strong sense of itself and its sort of place in the world. And then as I became a teenager in the 90s, indie music came to the fore. And this idea of an independent alternative scene that was kind of out of step with establishment America. It was teenagers rebelling. And maybe every generation in America has that. But it had a big influence here in the UK. And actually UK music and Britpop surged around the same time, because we weren't, as a country, just looking to America for our music and our culture. We were creating our own independent culture. I remember musicians like Oasis and Blur, who were big when I was about 18, were singing in English accents. Yeah. This was a big deal, and I'm from Manchester, so having Oasis singing in a northern accent was kind of incredible, and being really popular and successful. But that America, I think, of my childhood, what's sad about it is that even though I think it probably actually largely some of it, it does exist in real life, but the media, the culture in America has lost confidence in itself. And that's the institutions, so museums, newspapers, Wall Street to some extent is ambivalent about its own role in global finance. As a country, I think it's is questioning itself, and perhaps it's always done that in its history, but it feels more fragmented now. And I think some of that will end up affecting us a bit, because we're going through our own self-reflection, we're going through our own moment of introspection, and I think some of the language that's developed in America is starting to shape the way we talk. And not always in a healthy way.
Well, exactly. I mean, it would be fairly sort of downbeat so far. Emily probably had a slightly different view, but I mean, it could be that this is just within the warp and weft of democracies in noisy and difficult times. I'll just go flick back to Tomiwa on that. Do you accept the characterization that the problem, I mean, if I were to sort of parody this debate a bit, I'd say the problem's America. It's not doing this right, it's not doing that right, it's having all these problems, it's lost its self-confidence. I have to say, I mean, just launched, been in America for a launch, one of the things I noticed, you really do have to sort of speak the language of America. If your business is in America, your emails are in America, if you sort of come along and do your real sort of tentative British thing, everyone's saying, I'm so sorry, what even is that? So I don't get myself the idea that America's got less confident. I think it's certainly become more raucous and more divided. But tell me, do you see the problem as America, or do you see it in the way that we in Britain respond to the challenges of America?
I think it's both. And I think, just talking about language, so I decided to write the book in the summer of 2020 when I observed many young British people using the term BIPOC to describe ethnic minority people in the UK. And for those of you that don't know, BIPOC is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Now, that kind of term would make sense in America because of America's complicated relationship with not only its black population, but also its various indigenous communities. What I found perplexing was what that term was doing in a UK context. Using a word like indigenous makes you sound more like Nick Griffin than it does a university student that's 22. And I think one of the issues is, because I understand what Emily's saying about the fact that America, there is some British culture that's also exported to America. What I would say is that there is definitely an asymmetry. And I think it's understandable why there is an asymmetry, because simply put, America is the most powerful Anglophone country in the world. So it makes sense why there is that asymmetry, why it's almost like America is the metropole and the UK is the colony, or UK is the sort of like the 51st state. But the thing is, I think that Americans are not, black Americans in particular, are not only ignorant about black British people. I also think that black Americans are also ignorant about black people in Africa. Last year, my brother was getting married in Nigeria, and this brother in question lives in America, and he was getting married to an African-American woman, so a woman whose ancestors were the descendants of enslaved Africans. And she invited a lot of her family and friends to Nigeria, and for many of them, it was their very first experience of Africa. And I assume that for many of them, they expected a sort of homecoming, a sort of return of the prodigal son or the prodigal daughter. But the most striking thing was that from the perspective of the native Nigerians, what was most striking about these African Americans was not the fact that they were black, it was the fact that they were Americans. And this reminded me of a great episode of the American TV show, The Sopranos, during the first season, when the Jersey-born Italian-American mobsters go to Italy for the very first time. But there's only one, slight problem, which is that they can't speak Italian. And what was striking to the Italians, of course, the native Italians, was the fact that they were Americans. And I think this is also true, of the relationship between Irish American and people in Ireland as well.
Slight sidebar, I remember interviewing the director of The Sopranos about that and saying, how did he feel it had been a mistake to have The Sopranos go to Italy? Because I know, if you're a Sopranos fan, people divided very bitterly on this. And in an unguarded moment, he said, yes, I didn't think they were our best episodes. Anyway, this then practically sort of broke The Sopranos fan club in two. But it's also that sense of feeling so strongly that you identify with characters and a massively influential American series, probably the most in recent years. And maybe, you know, there's a big debate, isn't there? There's the Breaking Bads, the Wire, but that sort of sense that it really matters what, you know, these characters, are they allowed to go to Europe? I don't know. Which side are you on in this culture war? James, do you think that culture is a very good guide here? Because we've talked about politics and culture in a way as if they were interchangeable, but it is very possible to have political influences. In fact, many people did for many years. You have an American hero, someone they looked up to, perhaps in the Kennedy era, but they would have lived more in a kind of British, not exactly a monoculture, but much closer to sort of British culture which they do now. Or do you think now, partly because of technology, partly because of the streaming services, and that greater sense of connection that you kind of can't avoid, that culture and politics inevitably are more joined at the hip?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and I think culture now is more political than perhaps it was. I mean, this goes through phases, but I think perhaps a lot of the influence of American politics in a lot of people comes more through culture than through necessarily reading news articles. I guess to try and kind of make a positive point about all this, which has maybe been a bit negative, is that, you know, for all that America has its problems, there's an amazingly dynamic and intellectually and culturally dynamic place, and we love to talk about, you know, to praise the kind of exchange of ideas and, you know, the flow of cultures around the world. And it's maybe a mistake to expect that will always be an entirely benign process. Receiving new ideas is always a difficult and contentious process. And, you know, we're obviously receiving a lot of new ideas from America because, you know, if you're on the internet, and most of us spend most of our lives there, you're kind of half in America. And I just think, I don't know, I think there's an argument that perhaps it's a mistake to expect that process will be totally easy. And I also think there's a point to be made, which is how much would we like the opposite?
Yes.
I was reading a really good book by the historian Orlando Figes called The Europeans, which is about the great age of cosmopolitan European high culture in the middle of the 19th century. And he talks about how, you know, writers and artists moved all around Europe, from Russia to England to Italy. Italian opera was sung in every capital in the continent. And that age was brought to an end by the rise of nationalism towards the end of the 19th century. So Wagner, for instance, in Germany, became a real symbol of the German people, and the great suspicion fell on, you know, Italian opera singers, French opera singers. And, you know, these places did get cultural products that were more, I guess, authentically the products of the countries in which they were born, but that went along with nationalism, bigotry towards foreigners, and I guess sort of this debate now, and we're all, you know, upset, and, you know, I share the upset about the influence of, you know, American culture and politics on Britain, but what I think there is less of, and this might be a positive, is that there's less of that sort of anti-American bigotry in Britain that perhaps I grew up with. I remember my stereotype of Britain, of America as a kid, was, you know, they're all fat, they're all stupid. I mean, we had this George W. Bush desk calendar, which had a stupid George Bush saying for every day of the year. And this basically determined my entire view of the continent. I thought everybody was wearing a cowboy hat and sort of misspeaking all the time. So I guess there's a kind of counter-argument that I have to remind myself of, which is that, you know, this sort of contentious stuff is the price of being a cosmopolitan country in the mainstream of ideas in the world, perhaps.
I wish we were more like America in some ways, in many ways. I miss the ambition, I miss the energy, I miss the optimism, and economically, I mean, frankly, it's hard, it's uncomfortable to talk about, but take London away from Britain, and America is a much richer place, and people's living standards are significantly greater in many respects, and I don't buy this sort of, you know, it's all bad coming one way, and I wish. There's so many institutions that you sort of get involved in, and you think, God, there's something holding you back. There's something sort of apologetic about it, and you don't get that in America at all. And so, you know, I'll do my bit for sort of standing up with it. The one thing you were saying about Europe, sort of probably contradicts my point, but it's what I find interesting about political obsessives in the UK who I know. They will know the exact detail of Nevada and Arizona and which county is going to decide this election, which county is that. They're not going to know in any detail when the next French election is, when the next German election is, what the three parties in the German government now are. Now, given the position that Britain finds itself in now, that seems to me even more stupid, that the sort of lack of understanding and appreciation, the sort of obsessiveness goes too far that way and not enough on our neighbours the other.
Yes, there's a converse, isn't it, if you read some coverage of the UK in America, and I'd say not here as a political statement, but just looking at the media and some of the great liberal media, like the New York Times on Brexit, is if it's a Brit, regardless of whether you will leave or remain or what you think, it does have a slight, overnight you have become a third world country. Is there actually any fish in the shops? But this obviously is there because it resonates with a certain American highly educated audience who are just sort of comfortable with shaping of their view and imposing that on the UK. And we've talked a bit about it the other way around. So what would you change that all of you think could and should be changed so that we don't, before we go out to our audience for their thoughts and challenges, that we don't just do a lament here? So Munira, you felt the debate around race and about identity politics to an extent had been damaging. Do you think it will self-correct? Because if it's as crazy as you seem to suggest, and we have lots of freedom of thought, information sources, you would imagine that would self-correct. Why not?
I think the roots of this actually go further back beyond America. I think actually the main culprit when it comes to identity politics is probably Foucault and the French post.
Are you going to blame the French now?
So
okay.
we can blame the French instead.
That's a pivot.
But there are lots of different intellectual origins to these ideas. They've obviously coalesced in America and developed very deep roots in institutions. I'd also say therapy culture in America, which is not the same as therapy. I think therapy is a good thing. Psychiatry, psychoanalysis are good things. But therapy culture, which is a particular kind of brand of self-help, which is quite individualistic and very much about personal vulnerability. That also infuses American culture quite a lot. And I think that a lot of those trends have appeared in the UK. And they're quite hard. I don't know if they do naturally correct themselves. I mean, some people will say the reason things have got so crazy and so polarised is partly because of the economics of post-2008. If young people can't buy a house, if they can't see a positive future for themselves, they will turn to more extreme ideas and they will become disillusioned in the society they'll live with. So what we need to do is grow the economy again and everything will correct itself and we'll all go back to being normal. Yeah. I think that's a bit naive. I mean, you can still have, and in fact, you've seen the growth of a lot of these ideas even in times of increasing prosperity. The 90s, the 80s and 90s in America, a lot of these ideas around things like critical race theory, which, may have started with very good intentions, but have gone in interesting and I think worrying directions. But that grew at a time when America was actually, for a lot of people, there was prosperity. So I don't think it will naturally correct itself. I think people have to, I call myself a liberal. I think people have to make the argument again in each generation about why we treat everyone equally, why we don't, we judge people by the content of their character, not by the colour of their skin. You can't take for granted any of those ideas. You can't take free speech for granted. And so I think you have to make the case for them each time. And in America, I think they will, it could get worse before it gets better. Hopefully we can still exercise a degree of moderation in the UK where it doesn't have to be so polarised. To
me, that's really the question that I wanted to put to you. I think we're on our last round before we open up the debate. Who are you really addressing this book to, apart from any grateful reader who will go to the signing in the book tent afterwards? There, I've done it. But you have, I think, a target audience in mind, it seems to me, of a sort of challenge to people who may be also shaping public discourse. They may be people who are writing the kind of rubrics for how you discuss certain issues on the BBC, or they may be in the policy world, or maybe in the corporates where there's a lot of kind of what's the safest thing we should do here, and if we're not sure what to say or how to address certain groups, then let's take the path of least resistance, and even if it's clunky and even if we don't believe in it. Is that the kind of, I gave you a few thoughts there, but who do you think you would need to address your argument to change a kind of opinion away from, well, actually, yes, it is all like America, and isn't it all terrible?
I think the book is fundamentally addressed to anyone who's interested in a more open and a less reductive conversation about race and diversity in the UK. More practically, you've mentioned corporate leaders. I would also add teachers, school teachers, and the importance of education, the importance of not assuming based on the identity of any individual pupil things about them, the importance of emphasizing that black people and ethnic minority people in the UK are just as British as they are whatever racial or ethnic background they come from. And despite the title of the book, I wouldn't consider my book to be anti-American. In fact, I think it's pro-American in many significant ways. Many of the thinkers that have most influenced me are black American thinkers, thinkers like James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Albert Murray, and what they emphasized was the importance of context and the importance of the fact that black Americans are not simply black, but they're also fundamentally American as well. I'm just trying to apply that to a British context.
James? Thoughts on that in particular? Or I think the aim at this point was to sort of say, like, who is this argument really addressed to? And does it get kind of corrected as much through culture and through things permeating in the cultural and social spheres as it does with the kind of on-the-nose big arguments about identity or about politics? What's the role of culture here?
Yeah, well, I think your point was actually very good about what kind of cosmopolitanism we have and why, politically we pay so much attention to America, and we pay so much cultural attention to America. I'm on a bit of I'm tempted to educate myself about film at the moment, so I keep going to the cinema to watch films from the 60s and stuff. And a lot of the films I've been watching that are famous films of the 60s are like maybe French or Russian. And I think there was a time in British culture when a knowledge of European cinema or European literature was viewed as much more important. And I think we've perhaps lost that. And one way of, kind of getting a better handle on the context of everything may be a sort of a more generous cosmopolitanism that doesn't obsess on America, but we remember that we also live in Europe, which is an amazingly interesting and diverse place with an incredibly rich culture. And if we tuned into Europe as well as America, that one distorting American force might have other forces to meet it that might give us a sort of more reasonable perspective on our own country. Yeah,
and also many of those. In fact, the interesting thing is that in the 60s and 70s, many American films or American filmmakers were inspired by European filmmakers as well.
Yeah, and even remaking European.
Yeah, exactly.
So just, sorry, you wanted to say something that was in your head, but I just thought it would be great to get your sense of where you think this debate would go if there was a change from a government on the right of centre to the left of centre within the next year. Would you expect, knowing what the late Queen Mother used to call the dear old Labour Party, would you expect the dear old Labour Party to kind of fall into convulsions about this, or do you think that there is almost a kind of desire to leave it on the sidelines and try to talk about other things, because it is, as we've reflected here, fantastically capable of distracting and dividing?
No, I mean, had the previous leader of the Labour Party been elected as Prime Minister, I think the whole thing about Britain's relationship with America under Jeremy Corbyn was, to your point, in convulsions. No, not at all. And actually, for anyone that's read David Lammy's piece in the New Statesman very recently about how his long history and relationship with America, if I think about what is going on right now between many growing links between the British Labour Party and those in America, visits back and forward, sharing ideas, both on policy and campaigning, I'd say the relationship is very good. The one thing I would say, though, of course, is we haven't talked about in this conversation at all. We've broached Europe, but there are other parts of the world too that I don't think we think anywhere near enough. We haven't talked about the Britain's and America's relationship with China or with India or with other major global forces that are going to shape our politics. So for all the talk about America, and obviously this was the topic of our discussion, it can dominate. There are other things going on.
Dangerously broad-minded there. Let's go out to the floor. Right, there you go. There's a lady who's like, she's straight off the blocks there. That was the fastest ever start. And very welcome from the chair's point of view. Let's just ask if you are, if you don't mind.
My name's Rebecca. I'm a school teacher. So somebody I think needs to urgently read Tomiwa's book is Bridget Phillipson, who is going to, I hope, be an education minister in an incoming Labour government. I think the single biggest change that could happen in the curriculum, we can rewrite particularly the primary history curriculum, because at the moment, thanks to Michael Gove, we have to start in the Stone Age, and by the year 6, we've got to 1066. Then Black history gets shoehorned in Black History Month when teachers, pressed teachers, then grab something on Rosa Parks, when actually what everybody needs to be learning about is things like the Bristol bus boycott, the 1948 Nationalities Act, empire, slavery. That's what we need to be teaching children in our history curriculum, not endless Rosa Parks in October.
Right, thank you. Strong question. Who'd like to have a go at that?
Well, it's been a while since I looked at the national curriculum and what's prescribed and what's not. I mean, partly judging from what my own son gets taught at school, there's a degree of freedom that teachers have. And I think there's a lot of... certainly my son's come home and learnt a lot about Mary Seacole, for example. Do we teach enough... I mean, we probably don't teach enough history, full stop. And I think that's a bigger complaint I would have. But I do think teachers, it's incumbent on teachers to try and, teach a broad and, broad-minded approach to the curriculum. I don't quite buy, I mean, sometimes you hear people say, oh, we don't learn anything about the empire or slavery. And those are people who maybe went to school 30 years ago. I think it has changed quite a bit.
Let's just get quick thoughts from anyone else on the panel on that. Sorry, we've got about a generous sort of 10, 11 minutes, so let's just keep it moving. Emily?
I'm not sure the way that we learn about British history and our place in the world actually reflects how the Western world see us. That's the one thing I would say about having lived in multiple continents around the world. We're not set up to know our own history in a way the rest of the world sees it. And, we talk about America. I mean, if you go to a tour of the US Capitol, that every American that goes to visit DC watches it. I mean, the view of Britain in that video, I saw it last month, is absolutely not what you would think Britain's sort of Americans' view of Britain was. I don't think it sets us up well.
I'm going to quickly chip in on that, and that possible over-reliance also on key characters who the lady was suggesting. If you were very pressed and you've got a very squeezed timetable and you don't think there's enough of what you'd like in there anyway, there's a tendency, I think everyone has read their child's Mary Seacole essay, and it was just in my house, and I'm like, can we just try someone else? Knock yourselves out. Is that fair, or do you think that you do need to have certain figures that teachers can coalesce around easily in the curriculum?
I think in regards to Black History Month, I agree with the lady in saying that it shouldn't be something that's sort of tacked on as though it's a sort of exotic plant. But it should be something fully integrated into British history. And just to add to what Munira said, I think history is not being taught well enough in general. And I think that there should be a foundation, a greater foundation of teaching history upon which we can then teach the various aspects of that falls under British history, rather than sort of coming at it from a more polemical angle in the first place.
So I should add, I forgot to mention that the government has actually commissioned, and it came as one of the recommendations in the Sewell report, has commissioned some work on additional curriculum material on teaching about the diverse stories of Britain. So using, and not just the Black experience, but obviously the British Indian experience and other ethnic groups. So I think there have been some moves in recent years. When I worked in the Mayor's office in London, and we did quite a lot of curriculum development work about London as a city. So it's entirely possible to do it.
Should we take another question? Let's go over here. We've got a lady in the front. Yeah, thank you. Cheers.
Hi. Sorry. Just a question about patriotism, because obviously it's quite a big part of American culture and British culture, and I just sort of wondering what the panel thought and whether you think it's actually quite a destructive force in America, sort of ignorance and, I don't know, yeah. Just
Patriotism is the key, the word patriotism.
Yeah.
Yep. James, why don't you go on that one?
Yeah, I always think of The Simpsons, with the difference between American and British patriotism. I always think of The Simpsons episode where I think Lisa maybe has grown up and acquired an American boyfriend, and then Homer attempts to welcome him to America and puts the British flag on the flagpole in The Simpsons' front garden and then accidentally sets it on fire, which is like infuriates this guy. But I thought the interesting thing there is that's completely not true to how, you know, Americans have this real fetish about the flag and the burning of the flag is a terrible thing. I don't think British people feel the same way. I mean, I have to say, I think I feel much safer with British patriotism, which I think is always much more ambivalent and ironic and, you know, easily embarrassed, which I think has only got to be a good thing. I kind of distrust all, you know, all these sort of terrifying, strong political emotions. I'm inclined to agree that, yeah, I find patriotism a little bit, well, in small doses I'm fine with it. If it gets intense, I find it a bit frightening.
Patriotism's like the Angostura bitters of the gin and tonic. The bit of it is great. Anyone else like to just come in on that? Otherwise we'll go to something. Patriotism, strong feelings?
It's definitely a double-edged sword, but many of the most eloquent and the most effective and the most powerful advocates for racial equality in America do it on the basis of American patriotism. So you can't really understand, for example, the rhetoric and the principles of Martin Luther King without understanding how steeped he was in American religion, American constitutional norms, and American values.
Well, it just makes me think of going back to the previous questions about teaching history. When I helped teach a class of undergraduates about the First World War, American undergraduates, and we talked about the topic, and they looked unbelievably blank. They'd never heard of the First World War. Then one guy said, "Oh yeah, it started in 1917." I said, "Well, actually, it didn't." But you know, American view of its own patriotism can sometimes forget the rest of the world's contributions in some of the recent past. But you know, sometimes I do think I have to say, to my earlier point about missing the ambition and the energy, you know, being slightly more, with a healthy degree of cynicism, being slightly more proud of Britain and Britain's achievements. Sometimes the cynicism, I feel, holds us, I have to say, holds us back a little bit.
lot more overt patriotism, for instance, now across the political spectrum. You can't keep away from a flag, can you? You know?
It is on a lot of the banners.
How do you feel about that? And also, not you, but how do you think a lot of people, you know, thinking people in Labour feel about it? Sort of ambivalent, or like, yeah, we got to do this?
Well, I mean, look, this is probably a challenge to some of the people on some of my own political tradition, but why feel uncomfortable about your flag? I mean, it's Britain. Why? I mean, there's plenty of stuff I'd love to change about it, but it doesn't change the love I have for it. And I have to say, as a political tactic to sort of bring people along with you, I've spent way too much of my life, you know, campaigning, knocking on doors. You know, doing everything down and saying how bad the country is not a wonderful political tactic either. I have to say, I've not found it being a wonderful rallying cry about we're awful, we're terrible. Oh, that's uplifting, that's inspiring. I want to go out and vote for that. I mean, come on, I think some people in the Labour Party might pay for
the misery
that.
memo. Right, let's get a couple of questions. Actually, we've got quite a lot going on. Let's take someone at the back. Sorry, that means our runners run to the back. And there's a lady here, and a gentleman in the front. Let's get as fast as we can. Let's see what we can get in.
Hello, thank you. What a wonderful discussion. And it's really made me wonder, if we were sitting in the Clifton Literary Festival in America, would they be having the same discussion in the other direction? So how British culture has distorted America's views on itself?
No.
If not, why not? But if so, what topics do you think they'd be discussing?
There'd be a huge sort of Livingston kind of advance and taking this festival all over the world, and then they'll all be talking about this. Could you just hold your thoughts on that, and just wave again if you were really, really keen to ask a question. Let's take the lady there in the middle, and we'll try and get, you know, panel, you can just pick and choose from this. What would they be discussing when Clifton takes over most of the American states? Right.
I wanted to ask, does the panel think the special relationship still exists? And if not, what kind of relationship is a Labour government going to have with the US administration?
That's probably enough to be going on with. Who'd like to start? Who hasn't had a... But Tom, let's go back around the panel this way. It's going to be short answers.
Okay. In short, to your first question, my response would be no. And in response to your second question, my response would be, because your question implies that there is another country around the world with which America thinks has a great degree of influence on American culture and politics, and I can't, for the life of me, think of any other country that might be. Maybe China. Maybe China could be, because of the influence of TikTok on American teenagers. That could be a potential alternative topic.
James, come on in. Let's try and get answers to both of those questions, but spread out around the panel. So either special relationship, or what do you think will be being discussed? Were we to go through Alice through the looking glass, and we have this setting and this kind of festival in the US? What do you think the preoccupation?
Well, it's hard to say what they... my suspicion is that Americans don't think about us nearly as much as we think about them, and that's simply because the economy is so much richer, it's so much more culturally powerful, and we're just a much smaller country. I think actually a lot of the British obsession with America is with the drama of America. Everything's on a much grander scale. A lot of British politicians who are obsessed with America, I think, really regret that they can't stride through the Senate and make speeches to the Senate and get to be president. And they, I think fair play to them. They live in an amazing, dramatic, enormous country. We live in a much smaller, thankfully, less dramatic country. It's, they should talk about themselves. Yeah. I would be if I was. I'm talking about them here.
Cheese is a lot better, though. Right, Munira. Special relationship or
certainly, when the special relationship, when Churchill said it, it was partly an invention, and it was deliberately designed to sort of bind America in. But I think obviously there's a shared history, but there's also a shared ideal, which is essentially the liberal model, the Anglo-Saxon model, which is both an economic and a cultural one. And I do think that will be increasingly important in a multipolar world. So even if we are certainly smaller economically and culturally, I do think we offer something to America which is important to them in Europe, but also increasingly in our interactions with other countries around the world. On technology, we're very used to kind of doing Britain down, but on technology, Britain actually does punch way above its weight. And you see with the discussion around AI, we do have DeepMind. It was bought by Google, but it was and is part of a cluster of really interesting AI companies in London and UK. We have a thriving life sciences sector around the UK. We have this incredible intellectual sort of knowledge capital for a country of our size, which is, still outperforms most other countries. China and the US, obviously much, much bigger, very, very powerful, able to invest financially, but we've got quite a long history of academic institutions and just cultural capital. And I think that does mean something to America. And they like doing business with us for that reason.
I suppose we can ask you from direct experience, because you were at Harvard, you've a different setting, but you would have got the kind of vibe of what people asked you most about or most engaged in. So I wonder if anything stuck in your mind from that experience, and then a quick word on special relationship, and then it's tea time.
They talked a lot about 1812, and not the sort of Tchaikovsky overture that I imagined, but when we burned down the White House, it was an interesting reminder that the way the Americans learn history, as I said earlier, has a very different slant to Britain, especially at the beginning in the Revolutionary War. It's a huge part of its culture. We misunderstand that at our peril. But there are things that Britain, to Munira's excellent exposition, that's so brilliant at. We don't talk about it with the excellence and skill and ambition and passion, and we're great at this stuff. Despite the great campaign that you see around the place, we could do that a lot more. And in terms of special relationship, the only thing I would say is that if it's the current administration, I think it's in excellent health. But there is, of course, an American presidential election taking place next November. And if an alternative candidate wins, I think we're better off as to how the relationship between that Trump administration and the Keir Starmer Labour Party would be. I guess we'll have to find out.
That certainly would be worth returning for to debate. And you're absolutely right about the 1812 and the burning of the White House. I think Joe Biden brought a brick or something, didn't he, to give to Rishi Sunak, or I think either on the trip to Washington or here. And I think there's probably quite a collection of those now from prime ministers have each been given some charred bit of brick and told that it was from 1812. But it's not a preoccupation, I think, that so much in the kind of British legacy, and that's just one small difference. I would say, what do I get asked most about? It's with Boris Johnson, was his hair real? Definitely, I get that a lot. And, how are we all living in the aftermath of Brexit? They're probably the two things that I don't think I've got through a dinner in America recently without. But listen, thank you very much indeed for exploring Atlantic Dominion and where it might take us. To my excellent panel, and of course the sacred book signing by Tomiwa will be occurring in the book tent in just a moment. Do pass by, say hello to me. You can continue the debate if I didn't get to your question. I'm sorry for that, but thank you very much.